We are live. ম্যাম সুগত নন্দী উনি অ্যাড হচ্ছেন ম্যাম। অরুণ বাবু অ্যাড হচ্ছেন। হ্যাঁ ম্যাম, হ্যাঁ ম্যাম। ম্যাম আগে আপনি ঠান্ডা মাথায় দেখুন, আপনি আগে ঠান্ডা মাথায় দেখুন যে কর্ডটা। স্যার আপনি স্ক্রিনটাকে রোটেট করুন বা ডিভাইসটাকে রোটেট করুন স্যার। স্যার না না না, সুগত স্যার আপনি আনমিউট করুন এবং আপনার ডিভাইসটাকে রোটেট করুন। ওনার স্ক্রিনটা ফ্রিজ হয়ে গেছে কোনো কারণে। সুগত বাবুকে, সুগত। হ্যাঁ ঠিক আছে ম্যাম। সিসি ম্যামের প্রবলেমটা কিছু একটা হয়েছে।
হ্যাঁ রোটেট করতে করতে এসে যাবে। হ্যাঁ আয় ভগবান, পাশে আসছে তো।
Finally, Sneha Kaur Choudhury is calling Bhagavan.
কেন আমি কি ভগবানকে ডাকি?
With the latest gadget, when the gadgets fail, finally we go to Bhagavan.
That's true, sir.
হেডে দিয়ে না লাভার যায়।
সোমক মন্ডলের মানে ওনার পেছনের ওই স্ক্রিনটা দেখেছেন? লুকস লাইক এ শাড়ি।
বেড়াতে গেছিল ছবি একটা,
ওটা ছবি
ওই কোথাও একটা বেড়াতে গেছিল পাহাড়ে। হ্যাঁ এরকম
শিমলা এটা।
তার আগে একটা যেটা ছিল সেখানে
সুন্দর। হ্যাঁ এটা ভীষণ দিকে, এটা বলছেন স্যার?
ওটা পর্দা। হ্যাঁ
লুকস লাইক এ গুড
পর্দা স্যার।
যাই হোক
কমপ্লিমেন্ট, এটা কমপ্লিমেন্ট, থ্যাংক ইউ ফর দ্যাট।
শিবরাম মুখার্জি লেখাপড়া করেন বোঝা যাচ্ছে, অনেক বই।
অরুণদাও জয়েন করে গেছেন।
কি হচ্ছে আমি তো বুঝতে পারছি না। You are also like now it's okay. It's okay. This is okay. Okay.
This is okay?
Yeah,
now it's okay.
তুমি ঠিক করে নাও, অ্যাডজাস্ট করে নাও যা করার।
I think it should be fine. But I'll have to keep my computer open. That's the problem.
Then you can't be seen.
Yeah. So I'll move the computer somewhere else.
Yeah.
I'll do.
Ha.
I'll do.
Oh, okay. I think she sorted the problem.
ম্যাম আপনার ভিডিওটা অন করেনি
চন্দ্রাবতী ভিডিও অন করো।
ম্যাম আপনার ভিডিওটা অন নেই আপনার কি ল্যাপটপটা ঠিক আছে হ্যাঁ শোনা যাচ্ছে না ম্যাম শোনাও যাচ্ছে না আপনি কি ওই লিঙ্কটা থেকেই জয়েন করেছেন কিন্তু আপনার ভিডিওটা
তো শিপ্রা
বলো
সবাইকে দেখিয়ে দেখিয়ে তুমি চা খেয়ে নিলে এটা কি ভালো হলো
আমার একটা সাজেশন আছে এরপরে রেগুলার গুলোতে একটু মানে ওই ডেলিভারি করে সবার বাড়িতে এক খাবার পাঠানো যাক তাহলে মনে হবে আমরা একই সাথে বসে খাচ্ছি
Good
না,
idea.
ওটা তো জোম্যাটো দেবে না বা সুইগিও দেবে না চা তো দেবে
প্রবলেম হচ্ছে তাহলে ওটা ছেড়ে দিন আপনি
ওয়েবিনারের এটাই একমাত্র সমস্যা লাঞ্চ বক্সটা আমরা মিস করি না লাঞ্চ বক্স বাকি সব ঠিক আছে লাঞ্চ বক্স ইজ মিসিং
সমকের খুব কষ্ট।
সবারই কষ্ট এটা বললাম না আমার একার কষ্ট সবারই কষ্ট
আপনার তো একটু বেশি হয়তো।
আজকে স্যার 4
Hello.
ঘন্টা খাটিয়েছিল আমাদের কাজী নজরুল রিসার্চ বোর্ডের মিটিং এ
হ্যাঁ
যত ফিল আর
কতক্ষণ
4 ঘন্টা 4 আওয়ার্স
বাবা
ও হ্যাঁ ওরা তো খুবই মানে
বেস্ট হচ্ছে আপনি
হ্যাঁ
চলে যান ম্যাম
এবারের সামনের দিন থেকে এমফিলটা যে কি হবে সেটা নিয়ে আবার একটা প্রবলেম নেক্সট মানে একাডেমিক সেশন থেকে এমফিলটা একটা সমস্যা করবে
আচ্ছা আচ্ছা আচ্ছা
আচ্ছা আমাদের 6টা 8 বাজে কিন্তু
I think Samara is looking for Chandravati. Hello.
চন্দ্রবতী কোথায় where is চন্দ্রবতী are you there
Hello.
চন্দ্রবতী your video is off.
Chandravati is coming.
I'm so sorry. I'm a little bit behind. I was just getting the emails about needing the headphones and microphone. I don't have one of those. Can you guys hear me? I can hear you.
We can hear you
Yes,
clear.
yes.
Yeah. It's okay.
That's really okay.
yes we can hear you
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. It's lovely to see everybody. Hello.
yeah
Hello,
how are you
hello.
Dr. SAMARA CAHILL
Yes. Hello. Nice to meet you.
hello
Dr. Samara, Professor Basab Chaudhary is our Vice Chancellor.
Oh, hello.
Vice Chancellor.
hello so nice meeting you
it's-
meeting you
It's lovely meeting you, Chancellor Chaudhary. Sorry, this is my first time on Google Meet, so I'm a little bit not familiar with the format.
so far you have done perfectly all right
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm really excited about Professor Nandi's talk and our Q&A sessions. These will be really cool.
চন্দ্রাভাকে একটা ফোন করি
শোনো
শোনো তুমি কোনটা চার্জে রাখো আচ্ছা আচ্ছা চলো সকালে চলে She's just coming. She's running to her phone.
Okay, using a phone to it. Sugata, again sideways.
Okay. I'll just see what I can do.
On.
Very sorry for the delay. This is due to my computer laptop, betraying me at the last moment. Anyway, I think we are live and we are about to start the program. So, good evening and a very hearty welcome to the Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Bashar Chaudhary of West Bengal State University, the Director of IQAC, Professor Arun Hota, my esteemed colleagues in different institutions, research scholars, students, and all the others who are watching today's event in our YouTube channel, which is English Department and CSGCM Web WBSU. We are overwhelmed by your response. I would like to mention here that there are about 950 registered participants, not to speak about the non-registered viewers who are watching this. I request you all to subscribe to our channel for updates of the events that we hold from time to time. Let me take this opportunity to inform you also that already 4 special lectures are lined up. I would like to come back now to the title of today's webinar and briefly explain what we had in mind while putting the 2 lectures together. The other history of the European Enlightenment reveals, to borrow an expression from Ruth Salvaggio, an enlightened absence, a fluid, undefined realm of chaos, monstrosity, madness, the feminine, the occult, the racial and cultural others, who threatened to disrupt the epistemic boundaries of the European Enlightenment. The repression of the marginal and the transgressive marks the power of the discourse of the other over Western hegemonic systems. We are glad to have with us 2 speakers, Dr. SUGATA Nandi from the discipline of history and Dr. SAMARA and CAHILL from the discipline of English, who will present their own understanding of how the British Empire dealt with its colonized other on the one hand and woman as its gendered other on the other during the heyday of British imperialism. I now request my colleague, Dr. Sneha Kaur-Choudhury, to conduct the rest of the inaugural session. Over to Sneha. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Chakraborty. Now I request our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Bashar Chaudhary, to deliver his inaugural address. Sir.
First of all, good evening to all of you. Can you hear me?
Yes,
We can.
Yeah. Am I audible to all of you?
Yeah, you're audible.
At the very outset, I would like to convey my thanks and gratitude to all of you, to the Department of English, West Bengal State University, now headed by Professor Chandrabha Chakraborty, and ably supported by all the teachers of the department, like Professor Shifta Mukherjee, Dr. Sneha Kaur-Choudhury, and Dr. Shomak Mondal. They have been doing a wonderful job, and today's webinar is also one of the testimonies of the work or activities of the department. It is something great. This particular webinar is being organized by the Department of English, Center for Studies in Gender, Culture and Media, and in collaboration with the Internal Quality Assurance Cell of the university. The Internal Quality Assurance Cell is being headed by Professor Arun Hota, and he is also there today with all of us. Professor Sugata Nandi of the Department of History is one of the speakers who is showing the importance of research in the university, and in the last few years has traveled quite a bit for his research and understanding of the different aspects of his subject. We have also got overseas speaker Dr. Samara CAHILL from BLINN College, United States, and she is there today with all of us. She will speak also in this webinar. Now, our students are there. Many persons have registered, although over here but the point is I heard from Dr. Professor Chandrapa Chakraborty that 950 participants have registered for this particular webinar, which is a great number so far as the interest in the webinar is concerned. It shows the interest that teachers or scholars are interested to take part. The West Bengal State University has many departments. One of the departments which is progressive, and perhaps in all the universities it is so. One of the departments is the English department, and the English department does well. Whoever is in charge of the English department, the idea is to improve the scholarship and the teaching and learning process of the English department. And I have personally seen the interest in the department of all the teachers over there. So I'm indeed grateful to all of them. It is ultimately, the university is run by the teachers, is for the teachers and the students. And even in this pandemic situation, when we cannot go to the university, we can at least do our teaching and learning process or do our work in terms of the development of scholarship through this kind of technology assisted things, like platform, Zoom platform, or Google Meet, or things like that. Now we are only utilizing 10, 20, 30% of this platform. All of you know that this platform kind of thing is going to come in the world in a very big way. All the US and UK universities are gradually going to, or rather gradually are gradually shifting to this platform where teaching and learning process will be done through what is known as hybrid system or blended learning system. So we are also doing that in this part. West Bengal State University is a very young university. When you talk about Oxford or Cambridge, as compared to that, where the English, the subject of English started as as a subject of importance, and literature, language, and all those things came up. Compared to that, our university is very young, only 12 years old. But in these 12 years, some of the teachers or many of the teachers are keeping their mark in the area of scholarship, and that is something great. Universities are not built in a day. Universities take time to build. It is time consuming to build a culture, and all universities are basically culture oriented. English department will have a culture of thesis and papers and teachers books, and gradually things will move. And in the next 50 years you will find that West Bengal State University will have a very good department of English, because of the culture that has developed, and that culture has been created by persons like Professor Mukherjee, Professor Chakraborty, Dr. Korchodhuri, Dr. Mondol, and others. I am very much delighted to see Dr. Sugata Nandi speaking here on Empire, Science and Subversion, R.H.ELLIOT and Indian Magic. The subject is Empire and its others. Now, this subject is brought a lot of mystery in my mind. I really could not understand what it is, because Empire and its others means, Empire is basically, a lot of light and lot of good things, and lot of etiquettes and customs and protocols and things like that. Against these etiquette, customs, and protocols, there are non-etiquettes, customs which are practiced by age-old people who are basically natives, and protocols which are not for the civilized nation, in the sense civilized in the sense that who are being civilized. That is a big question. I do not know whether Professor Dr. Nandi will ask raise those questions. It is really a question, who is really civilized. Native people say civilization is there because the old herbs and other sciences, they all started with the native people, and they had very good life over there with a lot of there was no coronavirus or SARS-CoV-2 causing problem. It was a very nice situation. Even the water of the Ganges was very pure 100 years ago, and there is the science behind it. Science is that when sunlight goes into water, there is UV radiation, and that ultraviolet radiation, and that ultraviolet radiation causes water molecule to split and produces oxygen radical. Oxygen radical is a very potent oxidizing agent, and because of the load of bad chemicals, I mean bad chemicals are pollutants, organic and inorganic pollutants. Those pollutants are small in concentration at that point of time, was small in concentration 100 or 150 years ago. And as the water was flowing down the Ganges with the large river base and with a lot of sunlight, it used to be cleaned. And when the Hooghly River was very clean at that time, clean because of the chemical and physical actions of the sunlight on water. So that was basically the pristine quality of environment, the pristine quality of our places. It was not so developed the way we have. We did not have Wi-Fi. The other day I was thinking that I was reading that if you have Wi-Fi through trees will be planted. Then there was a caption over there that but the trees are giving us a lot of oxygen. So that is what the caption is. And in United States, in one of the shops, I mean big shopping malls, it is written that if you buy this, you will get something free. So it is written over there, air and water are free. Something is free as long as the supply lasts. It was written over there. I mean, it is free as long as the supply lasts. So air and water are free as long as the supply lasts. So that is basically the modern civilization, that as long as the supply lasts, we will get clean water, air and clean water. So with this modern civilization, the native people may feel that our civilization is better civilization because we are having pristine quality of life. If you go to the mountains, if you go to Dr. Chandrabha Chakraborty is a very good traveler, and last year they had been to see the tigers over there, and Professor Chakraborty and Dr. Sneha Parchodri told me that they had seen tiger, and the royal attitude of the tiger charmed them to a very great extent. So the point is that pristine quality, brings into question which one is civilized and which one is less civilized, which one is more civilized. So empire and its others, when you put light on the empire, the other will look dark, and that dark probably will be talked about this evening when in this pandemic the roads opposite to my house are looking totally free of people. There is no I feel that there is no human being here. Everyone is working on the rooftop or on the veranda. They do not come down because coronavirus may strike them. So that is basically the situation. So Dr. Nandi will talk about empire, science, and subversion. So definitely that part will be very interesting. Dr. Nandi is a good scholar, great scholar, and I'm sure that he will make a mark. The other lecture is Form to Delight: Johnson's Perception of Women, Education, and Empire. Yes, all of us know Vidyasagar came during that time, and that widow remarriage started at that point of time. And Shoti Daho, the other day, Dr. Chandrabha Chakraborty informed that she has written something on Ram Mohan Roy, which has been published in a good book. So Ram Mohan Roy brought that Shoti Daho, I mean, burning of young ladies, and those were bad times basically. On one hand, the empire was going ahead with its march for its empire and for its empire building, and on the other hand, there was something bad also going on in Indian society. So that bad and that good. Now, this contrast is very interesting. Anything that is contrasting, that makes a very good sense. We always talk about good things in this society. This is very good. We have done this. Everyone talks about it. No one talks about failure. Although the failure is the most important thing in this world, because on failure builds a success. On the it is sad, but the history people will definitely corroborate with my point, that on the dead bodies are created empire. On the dead bodies are created big buildings. Now these dead bodies may not be of dead bodies of human beings. These dead bodies may be of dead bodies of trees, dead bodies of birds, dead bodies of ants, dead bodies of many other small insects which are totally extinct. So that part is basically the dark part, and I do not know. I have not understood the empire and its others completely, but I was thinking what may transpire in this whole webinar, and I was thinking that perhaps the English and history scholars this evening will try to catch this aspect of this aspect of empire, where there is dazzling beauty on one side, on the other side there is darkness. And from that darkness some characters are coming up, and some characters are also showing how dazzling they could have been if they could have been given proper atmosphere and environment to flourish. So maybe it is my understanding. I do not know much of this subject, because my subject is chemical engineering, and I always say that. But once I read something, a small caption, I try to make an understanding of my own in my own mind, and that is what I wanted to share with all of you. And Professor Chandraba Chakraborty, Professor Shipra Mukherjee, Dr. Sneha Korchaudhuri, and Dr. Shomak Mondal, and Professor Urun Hota, and all others with whom I get the privilege of working. They know that even if I do mistakes, they are here, there, and with their kindness, they will forgive me. So basically, with their kindness, they will forgive me, and they will again come back to me and say that this is something you did not do correctly, and I will say yes, I did not do correctly. At least now, let me rectify at this time at least. So anyway, empire and others, I tried to understand that way. But after seeing at about 5:30, Dr. Chakraborty gave me a call and reminded that you have to be present at that point of time. So thank you, Professor Chakraborty. Thanks to all my colleagues over here who are present. Thanks to all the participants who are hearing my lecture. Thanks to our overseas scholar. I am indeed grateful. And if Dr. SAMARA CAHILL anytime wants to come to the university, we cannot definitely provide airfare, but we can definitely provide hotel accommodation in this part. And if she comes to our university, and if I continue here for some more time, I will definitely try to see that you come here and you teach for a small course here, maybe for a week or so. That part of money we have, and we will be able to do for the university, maybe in the Department of History, Political Science, and Sociology, and English. All the departments together, we may have lecture. So it has been a splendid evening. Whenever West Bengal State University does well, I become personally very, very happy, because I was with Calcutta University. When I came to West Bengal State University, I had a feeling that I have been dumped, but I have come here and seen some beautiful people, seen some very, very nice human beings, seen some extremely talented teachers who could be anywhere in any part of the world, in any university, and could have done wonders. So they are here, and with their support and cooperation, I am sure they will take this university to a new height 25 years from now. It is my prediction. At that time, I will not be there. But the point is, I will definitely feel happy if I leave. Definitely 25 years I may leave, because I have a desire to live 100 years. So then I will personally feel very happy that university, we started with Professor Mukherjee, Professor Chakraborty, Professor Scott Chaudhary, and um, um, uh, um, um, our Dr. Mondol and Professor Hota and Dr. Nandi, Kaushik Bandyopadhyay, and I am not taking the name of science as people today. I am taking only the humanities because social science is very important. This morning, our Jadavpur University Vice Chancellor has made a case for social science and history and science. So he always does that, and I congratulated him, sir. You have always taken the calls, and today also we have taken you were taking the calls. So very good. It is indeed a great evening. You enjoy the webinar, enjoy the lectures. I convey my good wishes to our overseas scholar. We convey my good wishes to our own speaker, Dr. SUGATA Nandi, and to all my teachers who are here today on this platform. Thank you very much. Take the name of the university because ultimately nothing remains in this world. That is something I am realizing at this age. Nothing remains. If you mean anything by legacy, if you know what legacy is all about, legacy is basically your good work. So keep that good work and leave your mark on this world. This is one life. Leave your mark on this world, and then feel happy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, for your very vibrant and inspiring speech. Now I request Professor Arun Hota, Head, Department of Hindi and Director, Internal Quality Assurance Cell of the University to deliver his formal address. Thank you.
Good evening to all of you. On behalf of IQAC WebSU, I welcome you all to the international webinar organized by the Department of English, Center for Studies in Gender, Culture and Media, and IQAC WebSU. And as our Honorable Vice Chancellor in his inaugural address delivered us the lecture on this particular topic, which will be talked by our very own Dr. SUGATA Nandi and Dr. SAMARA CAHILL from USA. At the outset, I express my regards and gratitude to our very own Honorable Vice Chancellor WebSU, who has always given academic freedom, academic autonomy to all the departments of our university. And this is only possible when a person is an academician. He realizes the importance. I have no hesitation to say that there was a time when we used to hide our, you can say, our affiliation to this university, because unfortunately, prior to coming to Professor Basav Chaudhary as a Vice Chancellor, the university had a very bad name and fame. But now we are proud to be a faculty member. We are proud to be faculty members of this university, and this shows the progress and development during his tenure. Actually, Professor Chaudhary has always inspired us to utilize our own resources. And I have no hesitation to tell you, mention you here that English department is the first department in our university holding a webinar utilizing our own resource. I mean to say that Dr. SUGATA Nandi, which one of the very few fellow who has visited this overseas, and who is a very good scholar in his field. And today, as sir told, he will be delivering a very interesting lecture, and I will enjoy it, I hope, and all of you will also enjoy that. The topic of his lecture, that empire, science, and supervision, R.H.ELLIOT, and Indian magic. So this is how very interesting, and it will be I hope it will be an illuminating lecture. It is a great privilege on my part to welcome our resource person on this occasion, Dr. SAMARA CAHILL, who will be delivering on a lecture on Johnson's perception of women, education, and empire. I do hope and believe that you all will experience some new ideas and thoughts in regard to the subject. As I belong to Hindi, I would like to mention over here that in Hindi, the women perceptions changed in the year 1942 onwards, when Mahadev Verma took the prose pieces. He switched from poetry to prose, and the perspectives on women writing changed a lot. And this was the time when in the West there was no, after this only we see in the West the women discourses and all. But however, in Hindi, this perception of women writing and education, this came into existence properly in the era after the globalization, after 1990. However, I am not here to speak on the subject because I will be listening both our research persons' deliberations on this occasion. I welcome my esteemed colleagues, Dr. Mukhopadhyay, Dr. Chandrava Chakravarti, Dr. Snehakar Chaudhary, Dr. Somak Mandal, and thanks to the Department of English for organizing such an illuminating seminar or webinar. I also welcome to the teachers of our university, to the teachers of affiliated colleges, the researchers, the students, and the participants. Expecting a very interesting and thought-provoking webinar, and I assure you that I will be throughout the seminar, webinar, and I will also learn something from the lecture of Miss Dr. SAMARA CAHILL and my own colleague, whom we talk very regularly, SUGATA Nandi. Thank you all. Thank you, Sneha, for giving me the opportunity. Thank you, English Department.
Thank you, Professor Hota, for inaugurating this event. And now we move on to the first business session, which will be chaired by Professor Chandrava Chakraborty, Head, Department of English, and Director of Center for Studies in Gender, Culture and Media. I now request her to take over the session, introduce the speaker, and conduct the rest of the proceedings. Thank you.
Thank you, Sneha. I would, before beginning the first business session, I would just like to mention something. Sir has said that he can see 10 people here. That's because there are so many participants. They are watching this on YouTube. In the Google Meet, we are only the participants and the faculty members of the university are included. And Orunda, thank you very much for acknowledging that English department is the first department who is involving internal resources to conduct seminars, and this tradition will be carried forth in the next special lectures that we have already planned. I would now like to introduce my colleague, Dr. SUGATA Nandi. SUGATA Nandi studied history at Presidency College, Kolkata, and at Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. He earned his doctorate from Jawaharlal Nehru University. He is the recipient of several national and international fellowships, including the Sarai Center for the Study of Developing Societies, Delhi Fellowship, 2006-2007, the Fulbright Nehru Doctoral and Professional Research Fellowship, 2011 and 12, visiting fellowship at the Institute for Advanced Studies in the Humanities of the University of Edinburgh, UK 2018, and the first ever Senate House Fellowship of the University of London 2019. He has worked earlier on the history of crime and criminality in colonial India and has published 4 papers on that. He's currently working on a history of Indian magic in the modern age. He has presented papers at 25 international conferences in India and abroad and given public lectures at JNU and the University of London. He has taught at Presidency College, Calcutta, and now works in the Department of History of West Bengal State University. So over to Dr. Nandi for his lecture on Empire Science and Subversion, R.H.ELLIOT and Indian Magic.
Thank you, Chandravati and Professor Bashop Choudhury, Professor Arun Hota for this very generous introduction. I hope that I'll be able to live up to your expectations. And as you know, the topic of my lecture is Empire, Science and Subversion, R.H.ELLIOT and Indian Magic. Now, I'll start my lecture with a little bit of anecdote. I started working on magic some 4 years back. And at that point in time, I was practically groping in the dark and looking for what we historians call primary sources, and I couldn't find it. And at that point of time, I found a book by a man called Robert Henry Elliot, about whom I knew nothing at that point. And I found that Robert Henry Elliot was a scholar, a scientist, an amateur anthropologist, and an army officer in India. And he was very well known also as a magic scholar during his time. I was amazed by the amount of work that he's produced and is published in a large variety of magazines and journals during his time, and in published books on Indian magic. And I'm going to talk about a bit of it. Bring in everything that he's written, because his work is exceedingly voluminous and is exceedingly varied. So I'll talk about one part of his work where he concentrated on a few tricks of Indian magic, and especially what we call the Indian rope trick. Now, let me ask a question to all of you who are listening. Have you ever seen the Indian rope trick, or do you know what the Indian rope trick is? Okay, so
the microphones are off, so we'll be able to interact with you.
I'll put the question across you. So let me just quickly give a summary of what the Indian rope trick is. The Indian rope trick is a gravity-defying act in which a magician throws a rope and it hangs from thin air. And it's a very long rope. You can barely see the top of the rope, which practically vanishes in the sky. Then a boy assistant of the magician climbs up the rope and he vanishes as he reaches the top. The magician feigns anger and he asks the boy to come down. The boy could be heard from a distance because he's climbed up the rope, and he speaks rather defiantly. He disobeys his master. Then his master, the magician, becomes very angry and he climbs up the rope with a sword. And a few minutes later, the audience who are standing on the ground, they could see limbs, gory limbs falling from the skies. And then the magician comes down. He's even more angry. He gathers those limbs and in a bag, and he chants incantations. A little later, the boy emerges from within the crowd, and there ends the trick. So this is the Indian rope trick. Now, I haven't seen the rope trick. I expect nobody has ever seen the rope trick. But we have all heard about the rope trick. And this is what Elliot had written on extensively, which has now, since the 1990s, prompted historians to do research on this area. So I'm going to talk about that. And I'm going to talk about the debate on the rope trick that took place between Elliot, who didn't believe in the trick, who believed the trick was a hoax, and others who believed the trick actually existed and contested his claim. So I'll start with a little bit of introduction, or by way of introduction of this man called Robert Henry Elliot. He was born in Scotland in 1864. His father was an army officer. He was an outstanding student from the very beginning. He won the first prize several times in science contests, and he became a promising young scientist when he started pursuing his career in medicine. He became a doctor and joined the Indian Medical Service as a sergeant lieutenant in 1892, and he was posted in the northeast frontier during the Chin Hills campaign in 1892-93. From 1904 to 1914, he was posted at the Government Ophthalmic Hospital in Madras, which afterwards have been named after him. And he became the professor of ophthalmology at the Madras Medical College, where he served temporarily as the Surgeon General. He retired in 1915 and rose to the rank of Lieutenant Colonel in the Indian Army in 1912. Elliot made his name as a specialist in snake poison. He discovered that contrary to popular belief, the cobra was a timid serpent and would bite only when threatened. His first significant research in ophthalmology was a textbook on glaucoma, which was followed by a work on cataract operation. He published a treatise. Oh God, this is what I'm fearing. Excuse me. My sincere apologies. Okay. His first, he published a treatise titled Tropical Ophthalmology, which received accolades in medical fraternities all across the globe. On his retirement and return to London, he was appointed the Hunterian Professor of Surgery and Pathology at the Royal College of Surgeons and the chairman of the Navy and Military Committee of the British Medical Association between 1917 and 1922. In 1919, he was appointed lecturer in ophthalmology in the London School of Tropical Medicine and was an ophthalmic surgeon at the Prince of Wales Hospital. From 1919 to 1925, he was the examiner of surgical instruments at the Indian Store Department. He took up practicing magic as a pastime, and towards the end of his life, he gained reputation as an expert on Indian magic. His work as an ophthalmologist aided his study of optical illusions that any successful magic trick relies on. He stated in the preface of his treatise called Tropical Ophthalmology that we see what we had been trained to see, and we very often miss the obvious phenomena for which our minds are unprepared. His work on Indian magic was informed by the same principle. He died in 1936 in London. Elliot thus, as an ophthalmologist, had demonstrated that the human eye is capable of seeing things, literally. Meaning, seeing is not necessarily believing. To the Magic Circle of London, this scientific finding was critically important. The Magic Circle was the association of the greatest stage magicians of the time, when London was the mecca of entertainment magic in the modern world. It came to being at the behest of John Neville Maskelyne, born in 1839. He died in 1917. He was the greatest British magician of the turn of the century and an inventor par excellence. The main objective of the Magic Circle was to preserve the secrecy of the recipe of sensational magic tricks, which could have been easily appropriated given the absence of intellectual property rights of magicians back in those days. In other words, the purpose behind setting up of the Magic Circle was to preempt any possible challenge to the supremacy of the best known professional magicians of Britain and the West at large. The challenge, however, came nonetheless, that too from outside the pale of entertainment magicians. It came from people who believed that the magic of other countries was superior than the magic of the West. And when I say other countries, I mean magic of faraway lands located in Asia and Africa. By the early 20th century, a popular belief had gained ground in the West that India was the fountainhead of the highest knowledge of magic. Maskelyne, who rather rightfully styled himself a scientist, an amateur wonder, and an automata inventor, was vehemently against it. In 1913, he set up the Occult Committee within the Magic Circle to debunk such beliefs and expose that it had no foundation whatsoever in reality. In 1919, the Magic Circle appointed Elliot the chairman of the occult committee, from which point he started publishing articles following the style of fieldwork based on scientific research, and these works were on Indian magic. The culmination of these works came in the shape of a book titled The Myth of the Mystic East. The Myth of the Mystic East. It was published in 1934. While it wasn't the first book on Indian magic written by a Westerner who had lived experience of the phenomena, it certainly was the most influential and authoritative work of its kind. Elliot, after retirement from Indian medical service, in it he documented in detail his lived experience while in India and his eyewitness accounts. The most attractive feature of his book was his chapter on the Indian rope trick. He had come to the conclusion that the rope trick was a myth. It was propagated by Westerners since the end of the 19th century. The rope trick was first brought to the notice of Westerners in the 1890s, and I'm going to talk about it a little later. Elliot had spelled out the purpose behind his writing on Indian magic in a lecture given at the Royal Anthropological Society in 1933, where he said, and I quote, there's a widespread belief in this country that the East is the home of mystery. It may be suggested that such an idea is only prevalent among ignorant people, and that it's limited in its currency. But this is quite incorrect. Within the last few months and weeks, I have talked to men who have occupied high and responsible positions and who are by no means clear on this subject of mystery. They obviously have reservations and doubts, which they'll hardly admit to themselves, and yet they won't surrender lightly. Like many people with a weak case, some of them are apt to be annoyed when they are run down by merciless logic. And yet it's this merciless logic that's called for. He listed a set of reasons which, according to him, contributed to the erroneous notion that the East, particularly India, China, and later Tibet, were unquestioningly taken to be the home of mystery. While he didn't state what he meant by mystery, he employed the word to connote inexplicable phenomena witnessed uniquely in these countries only. Of these three countries, India enjoyed the lasting reputation of being mysterious, while China lost its pride of place to Tibet by early 20th century. To the Westerner at large, these faraway lands were which many couldn't travel to. These were faraway lands, which many couldn't travel to, and hence a story woven around the far distant and inaccessible land makes corroboration difficult and refutation impossible. An easy course then is to accept it, wrote Eliot. Added to this was the love of mystery to the common human mind in all countries and ages, and the sheer strange conditions that any newcomer to these new places, meaning India, China, and Tibet, had to negotiate upon his arrival, which was compounded by alien cultures and their unknown languages. As a result, and I quote, Eliot said, values were all altered in the first flush of contact with an Oriental people. These things made upon us a deep-cut impression that time has done little to efface. Unquote. The most remarkable difference that Eliot noticed was the possibility of death, which lurked at every step in the Orient, and especially in India, for the newly arrived European or American. The heat and dust benumbed him. Snakes slithered by him as he walked on the road. The cobra, or the hooded death, as it was popularly known, was practically omnipresent in the rural areas, and the panther or the tiger was a common predator wherever there were thickly forested areas. He noted that when tropical rain brought relief after relentless heat, swarms of insects descended on Earth to feast on the human body, and they leave it lifeless in the process. Such pervasive fear of death quite naturally altered perceptions of the white man hailing from a scientifically advanced and modern technology-reliant country, and in turn affected his memory, which seemed to be clouded by inferences and afterthoughts, which in turn obfuscated vivid remembrance in favor of fanciful telltales. This, in his opinion, was what made Indian magic a fascination to the Western mind world over. Taking stock of Indian magic as a performing art, he said, as an entertaining performing art, he said that descriptions of it given by Westerners who had been to India, are very often blurred recollections. He had watched nameless Indian magicians perform from the early days of his sojourn in India, and gradually he started bribing them to learn their tricks, which he found were based on the basic skill of misdirection and manipulation. What made the Indian magicians seem superior in the eyes of the Westerner was, however, in his opinion, their ability for manipulation, which he said was to be found in superabundance among Orientals. Having watched performances by countless Indian magicians, he concluded, and I quote, "The Oriental has time in plenty, and his patience is proverbial. He learns his tricks from his father or grandfather, and passes them on to his sons and grandsons. His repertoire is extremely limited. This is a very important point, for it enables him to concentrate his energies on a very limited set of manipulations. From childhood," please note that he is using the word manipulations as a synonym for magic or magic trick. "From childhood to grave, he does the same few tricks under the same conditions and in exactly the same way, all day long, all his life long, until he could almost do them when he is asleep," unquote. The tricks which made Indian magicians famous were, he listed, the basket trick, the mango trick, levitation, hatching chickens out of eggs at will, fire walking, fire eating, sword and glass swallowing, snake charming, and above all, the rope trick. Now, the basket trick is a trick in which the magician hides his assistant in a basket which is tire-shaped, and he plunges a sword through the middle, which is not occupied by his assistant, and then he opens the basket. His assistant to show that his assistant has vanished, and then the assistant again, like in the rope trick, emerges from among the crowd of the audience. The mango trick is one in which the magician plants a tree, the mango tree in this case. It grows to a height of 2 feet within a few minutes and bears a fruit, which he then distributes among his audience. Fire walking, fire eating, hatching chickens at will, glass swallowing, these are things I believe, and snake charming, these are things I believe you are familiar with. He gave scientific explanations for all the tricks except the last one, and was of the opinion that Western magicians had performed the first 3 tricks better than, which means the basket trick, the mango trick, and levitation, had performed the first 3 tricks better than Indian magicians, though having learned these from them since the middle of the 19th century. The rest of the tricks, he explained, could be performed with meticulous practice. The rope trick was the only one which couldn't be performed. Peter Lamont, the historian, has established that the rope trick was made world famous by the Chicago Tribune in 1890. It was a practical joke which the paper sold as news. It was actually a concocted account. From that time on, however, it became the best-known Indian magic trick world over. Modern Western magicians routinely denied its existence, and just when it appeared that the myth had been demystified and laid to rest, the firm believers in its existence sprung up from unexpected quarters. They challenged the debunkers, which are in this case the magicians, with claims of having witnessed the trick or having known those who have witnessed the trick in the past. A number of such believers came to the fore in Britain in early 1930s, compelling the magic circle to make an unprecedented attempt to establish that the trick was nothing but a figment of imagination. The occult committee took on the task and started gathering evidence, which came in the shape of oral and written statements. They couldn't find photographs of the trick, except one which had been published in 1917, which later was found to be of a child acrobat perched on the top of a bamboo pole, balanced by a man standing on the ground. The evidence gathered was extremely large, and a special meeting was convened by the occult committee in London on April 30, 1934, under the chairmanship of Lord Ampthill, the former acting Viceroy of India. He was Viceroy between April and December 1904, and the Governor of Madras between 1900 and 1906. As a large number of Europeans, and the British in particular, had claimed to have witnessed the trick while they were in India, the committee was forced to conclude that the meeting, forced to conclude the meeting with the advertisement which said, "We will give," I quote, "we will give 500 guineas to anyone who will, as claimed for the rope trick, as claimed for the rope trick in an open space far removed from trees and houses, throw a rope into the air and cause it to remain suspended, but unsupported by any physical means, whilst the boy climbs up and disappears at the top," unquote. The prize money remained with the magic circle, which, however, didn't imply its victory over the believers in the trick. I'll now quote a few examples of letters and submissions by the believers in the trick. One English physician, a Dr. Alexander Cannon, engaged in a bitter debate with Elliot, having claimed in a leading British newspaper that he had witnessed the trick in India in 1926. He said that he had watched the act being performed by an Indian yogi, and he wrote a letter. Excuse me. Sorry again. This is going to happen. Sorry about that. And he wrote a letter to the Daily Mail on 1st May 1934 that whatever Elliot was saying was absolutely untrue. The occult committee invited him to one of their meetings and offered him the prize money if he could bring the yogi to perform the trick. He turned down the offer, stating that he didn't intend to haul a holy man all the way from India for such a small amount of money. Now, 500 guineas back in those days was most certainly not a small amount of money. Elliot interviewed him once at the committee and found out that he came up with dubious claims that he had witnessed the trick once in Hanoi, in the then Indochina in 1896, and later in 1926 in India. After careful examination, Elliot said that both his claims were unfounded. They were false. That didn't mean that Elliot didn't face any further challenge. One Mr. Harold T. Wilkins of Bexley Heath didn't claim to have witnessed the trick, but was unwilling to dismiss it as a lie propagated over decades on the basis of the findings of Elliot. Elliot had published a piece in the British Medical Journal in 1934 on the Indian rope trick, and said that he has found that the myth of the trick is propagated by frauds and liars who had been to India, many of whom, he said, had never been to that country either. Wilkins, who never claimed to have traveled to India or an expert on Indian magic, said that Elliot's line of inquiry was wrong from the very beginning. He had chosen to unearth how fraudsters, rather than finding out how Indian magicians hypnotized the mass of spectators gathered around him. There were others who believed in the trick. I'll now cite a few other examples. One, Mr. B.R. Fairfax of Southampton wrote a letter to the Daily Telegraph on, on 5th May 1934. He said that he had watched the trick in Kasia, near Darjeeling, at the Victoria School grounds with 200 students, the headmaster and other staff, where he had studied. He wrote, and I quote, "We saw the performer throw up the rope, and it remained vertical in the air, apparently reaching into infinity. A native boy then climbed up the rope and disappeared into space. We heard the boy's voice refusing to come down when commanded to do so by his master. In fact, he had become quite impudent in his replies. The trickster pretended to lose his temper and cut the rope near the ground with a knife. The boy fell apparently from the skies at the feet of the juggler. After the exhibition, the headmaster described it as a wonderful exhibition of mass hypnotism and ventriloquism. The boy, as he states in the letter, emerged from the crowd of spectators within minutes of falling at the feet of the master." Another man who had written a letter to the same newspaper a couple of days later made a similar claim. His name was Mr. B.H. Springett. He was a London resident. He said that he had known British people who had looked for the performance of the rope trick during their long residence in India, and he had interviewed quite a few of them. He's admitted that only a few had been lucky to see the trick. Majority wanted to see the trick but couldn't. One man, an ex-army officer, had witnessed the trick and even took photos of it when the boy had climbed to the top of the rope. When he developed the film, he found, and I quote, "The films, when developed, showed no signs of the rope or the boy climbing it. What they did show was an audience intently upwards, as if watching a miraculous performance. The last picture showed the boy stealing quietly away to appear, presumably, from another direction." Elliot dismissed all such claims, which he said were nothing more than reminiscences and could fit squarely into his idea of a foggy memory of one's distant past in a distant land. He had dismissed the explanation based on mass hypnotism very early during his investigations because he found it a scientific impossibility. Then, after having been going through a few hoax photographs of the trick, which turned out to be pranks meant to enjoy momentary attention in the press, and a large number of similar claims of witnessing the trick, like the ones I cited above, he wrote in his concluding report on his findings about the rope trick, and I quote, "My committee has investigated a number of claims by those who say they have seen the rope trick. In every single case, the evidence breaks down under cross-examination. After many years of investigation, we have published a firm conviction that there is no proof that this trick has ever been done. We don't believe it ever will be." I unquote. However, such a conclusion didn't put the intense contest over the existence of the trick to an end, and the believers proved unflinching, unrelenting. I'll cite an example. This was a letter written by one Mrs. Frances L. Oldhams, a resident of Wimbledon, who had lived in India during her childhood and was in her old age when she had written this letter. This letter was published in a BBC periodical called The Listener in 1934. She said that she was in India as a child where her father worked. Her family lived in a small place along the banks of the Ganges, where one day an itinerant Indian magician and his boy assistant entertained them. She was 11 years old back then when, among other things, she witnessed the rope trick along with the rest of her family. She recollected the juggler threw a rope into the air where it remained. He said a few words to the boy who proceeded to climb up the rope. Having reached the top, while we were looking at him, he disappeared. A moment or two later, I saw him coming towards us through an avenue of cork trees, which was a feature of our compound. My immediate reaction to the occurrence was one of intense interest than the overwhelming wonder which an adult would feel. I have no theories to account for the illusion, if illusion it was. I can only recount an event which made an indelible impression on my mind and leave to skeptics the task of explaining the trick to me if the inexplicable can be explained. Now, I have come to the end of my presentation. I'll just leave you with a very brief conclusion of my study. Elliot's painstaking efforts at debunking Indian magic in the name of modern science amounted to claiming cultural supremacy of the British Empire over its colony, India. While there's no denying the fact that he based all his conclusions on years of observation and fieldwork, on years of observation and fieldwork, his approach from the very beginning was that of an Orientalist. Interestingly, his contest was with another group of Orientalists. He belonged to that group of Orientalists who created what Edward Said has called the high or superior Orientalist knowledge, which learned classicists and scientists like him catered to and created. The other variant of Orientalist knowledge, which Edward Said has called inferior knowledge of Orientalism, relied on rumors, beliefs, and free-floating notions, which very often, as we can see, as I've been able to find in my research, prove to be of immense commercial benefit to Westerners. Eliot was waging a war against, and he was waging it with very little success. I'll leave you with the example of one book which you can find on the internet for free. It's written by an American hypnotist and magician called Ormond McGill. Ormond McGill had visited India in the 1970s. He wrote a book on the Indian occult. And he started the book stating that he had traveled to India with his brother, and they were filming performances by Indian magicians all the way through, and he had got in touch with several of India's holy men, because he was looking for the fountainhead of the most superior knowledge of magic. And he concluded his book by stating that Indian magic was like magic of no other country. It was different from magic of the West. It was different from magic of any other Asian or African country, because Indian magic, he believed, was supernatural. Thank you.
Thank you, Sugata, for a wonderful lecture. It was extremely illuminating. Let me go back to my technical support team and see if already questions have come. If they haven't come yet, we can take the questions at the end of Samara's lecture. So, Orithro and the others, do we have questions right now? I think most of the questions are being typed in the YouTube chat box, which is creating some problem for us, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Can you read out some?
Ma'am, we can have the
Yes.
questions later, I guess, because the groups are
Yes.
not get any questions in the groups.
Okay,
Let us
okay.
collect it from the YouTube chat box then we can post
Right.
it.
I think so. We'll take the questions later. So over to Shipra, the Professor Shipra Mukherjee or Shipradi for Samara's session.
Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, you are. Ipra,
Ma'am, you are not audible, ma'am.
mute. You are mute. Please unmute it.
Shipradi, we can't hear you. Shipradi,
Yes.
we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, we can. Yes.
Okay. It is my pleasure to welcome to today's webinar Dr. Samara and CAHILL, who joins us today from BLINN College at the US of A. Samara's area of research is 18th century English literature, with a focus on intersections of gender, religion, nationalism, and the environment. She has co-edited the book Citizens of the World, Adapting in the 18th Century with Dr. Kevin Cope. Her book, Intelligent Souls, Feminist Orientalism in 18th Century English Literature, was published also by Bucknell UP in 2019. She has written over a dozen articles or book chapters on topics including Samuel Richardson and Chinese Gardens, Mary Wollstonecraft and Feminist Orientalism, Sustainability and Pedagogy, and Stereotypes of Muslim and Roman Catholic Masculinities. She is also the book review editor of 1650 to 1850, Ideas, Aesthetics, and Religion. Samara will be speaking to us today on Formed to Delight, Johnson's Perception of Women, Education, and Empire. Over to you, Samara.
Thank you very much, Prof. Shipra. Okay, I have a PowerPoint. I'm going to try to, this is my first time on Google Meet, so let me see if I can open it up so that all of you can view it. So if you'll hold on one moment. All right, and let me open this. So does everybody see the slide Form to Delight?
No, we can't see it yet.
No.
Ma'am, you have to present your screen. See the left bottom corner of the screen. There is a thing written called
Present now option.
Yes.
There is a
Yeah.
present now.
Can you see it now?
No, yes. You have to click the whole screen and then
to make it full screen.
Okay, let me.
I'm doing the full screen part. It's all right now. It is visible. I guess. Yes.
It's okay.
Perfect.
But
Oh, perfect. Okay, thank you. I'm sorry, I'm very new to this. Thank you so much for having me today. Thank you to West Bengal State University, to Professor Chandra Chakravarti, Professor Mukherjee, Professor Shipra, and Professor Nanda. I'm so happy to be here, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation later. It's exciting to see innovative international communities increasingly developing despite the restrictions of the pandemic. It's crucial to be forging these kinds of interdisciplinary and global collaborations in order to decolonize our institutions, our scholarship, and our teaching. North American-based 18th century scholars such as Eugenia Zuroski-Jenkins, Carrie Sinanan, and others have been calling for such decolonization recently in light of government crackdowns on Black Lives Matter's protests, recognition of the systemic racism of American higher education, federal and state COVID responses. My state of Texas is one of the hotspots, and the justice of honoring indigenous rights and sovereignty in the lands now known as the United States of America, a nation, some would consider it an empire, founded on the backs of enslaved and forcibly displaced peoples. I speak from Bryan, Texas, on the ancestral lands of the Tonkawa and Santa tribes. So to begin the presentation, this is going to be the kind of the rough schedule I follow. So I'd like to begin this talk with some context about why Samuel Johnson's perception of women, education, and empire matters. Specifically, his contradistinguishing of what he took to be the merits of Christian education against what he took to be the disadvantages of Muslim education. So I want to stress that the portrayal of Christian education and Muslim education, there's a lot of stereotyping and Orientalism going on in there. Then I'll discuss Johnson's attitude to colonialism and slavery and the context of European attitudes to the Ottoman Empire before turning to Johnson's two texts of women's education in Ottoman spaces, Irene, his tragedy of 1749, and Rasselas, his philosophical tale of 1759. My argument today has developed out of my book, Intelligent Souls, Feminist Orientalism in 18th Century English Literature, and is part of a new project on Samuel Johnson and gender. In Intelligent Souls, I argued that between 1695 and 1792, English women writers used a stereotype of Muslim despotism represented most centrally by the Ottoman Empire to argue for better education and professional opportunities for women in England. So Joyce Zenana has talked about this feminist Orientalism being the displacement of Western women's own anxiety and distrust of Western patriarchy onto this kind of mystified Oriental other. These writers explicitly juxtaposed Christian women's intelligence, or what they took to be Christian women's intelligence, with what they took to be Muslim women's intelligence. They blamed the assumed disparity on Muslim women's allegedly inferior, because Muslim, this was their thinking, education. So how does Samuel Johnson fit into this narrative? Johnson mentored, supported, or published a number of women writing in the mid to late 18th century, including the novelists Frances Burney and Charlotte Lennox, the Bluestockings, so those would be kind of sociable women intellectuals, Bluestockings Elizabeth Carter and Catherine Talbot, and the Welsh poet Anna Williams. Johnson was against slavery and highly critical of colonialism and empire. though he had a complex range of opinions about what he called the Mohammedan world. He was convinced of the moral superiority of Christianity over Islam. So part of what I'll be looking at today is the fact that Johnson is very critical of empire, of colonialism, and of slavery, but he has this this Orientalist attitude to Islam. Finally, Johnson used the assumed, and I want to stress that this is assumed difference in women's education in Christian and Muslim locations to highlight, one, the superiority of Christian education, as he saw it, by showing that, two, a well-educated woman would resist the worldly allurements of empire. This leaves us with two reasons for Johnson to focus his anti-imperialism on the Ottoman Empire, which was, of course, there were a lot of protected religious minorities in the Ottoman Empire, but the dominant religion is Islam. So why would he focus on the Ottoman Empire? A, Johnson was critical of empire in all its manifestations, but he was convinced of Christian moral superiority. And B, the Ottoman Empire particularly attracted the attention of rising European powers, whether prompted by envy, emulation, or a combination of both, as a model for their imperial ambitions. So I think my approach to empire is slightly different than Professor Nandi's, because I'm looking at the period where you could argue there's a British Empire, but really just before its heyday, before it starts becoming what we think of it as. So let me address the issue of Johnson's criticism of empire before turning to the more widespread phenomenon of imperial envy. So a selective timeline of Samuel Johnson's publications shows that his two major engagements with the nexus of women, education, and the Ottoman Empire were published or performed in the decade leading up to and including what's been called Britain's Year of Victory in the 7 Years' War, which effectively established Britain as the world's leading naval power. So this is where some scholars have called this the Second British Empire, but it's what we think of as the British Empire is after the 7 Years' War, when the British have dominated even all of the Europeans, other European powers. Thus, Johnson did not think about the British Empire as we would think of it today in retrospect. The greatest contemporaneous empires that Johnson would have been familiar with would have been either the declining Spanish Empire, the Habsburg, you could also consider it the Holy Roman Empire-ish, or the Ottoman Empire. Notably, Johnson did not include an entry on empire in his Dictionary of the English Language, which was published in 1755. However, he was extremely critical of practices that we would today associate with early modern empires, such as colonialism and slavery. As his biographer, his pro-slavery biographer, James Boswell, recorded in his notes on a conversation they had in 1777. So this is Boswell, who disagrees with Johnson, reporting what Johnson said about slavery. He had always been very zealous against slavery in every form. Upon one occasion, when in company with some very grave men at Oxford, his toast was, "Here's to the next insurrection of the Negroes in the West Indies." So you can imagine how the dons at Oxford saw this in the 18th century. His violent prejudice against so this is Boswell speaking, our West Indian and American settlers, so these would be the English colonists in the then American colonies and in the West Indies, appeared whenever there was an opportunity. Towards the conclusion of his Taxation No Tyranny, he says, so that's one of his pamphlets, he says, "How is it that we hear the loudest yelps for liberty among the drivers of Negroes?" And there's been a lot of conversation in the US right now about the fact that the American Revolution could be seen as kind of a way of slowing down the progress that the British themselves were making in abolishing the slave trade. So the U.S. has an interesting relationship here to what Johnson is talking about when it comes to people talk about freedom, but do they really mean freedom for everybody? It doesn't look like they do. Johnson, in other words, was critical of the slavery of the founders of the United States of America and of the slave trade and colonialism of his own nation, which would become in the next century the seat of the British Empire. Let me now turn to the broader context of European perceptions of the Ottoman Empire before looking at Johnson's fictionalized contradistinction of Christian and Muslim education for women in Irene and Rasselas. Several scholars have identified an imperial envy that Europeans felt towards the Ottoman Empire, which had risen from relative obscurity in around the year 1300 to become one of the most powerful empires of the early modern world. For instance, Barbara Fuchs has discussed Europe's vision of Islam as external and internal threat in a context of nascent imperialism. Gerald McLean argues that imperial envy usefully describes the evolving dynamics of early modern English responses to encounters with the Ottoman Empire at a time when the English were seeking to find a place for themselves in the larger world beyond their insular realm. And Thomas Kiemer has argued, specifically of Johnson's work, that in Rasselas, the Arab chief turns out to be a world-weary Johnsonian melancholic who sees banditry as a just mode of resistance to Turkish imperialism. So that would be the Ottoman Empire of the Turks. Indeed, one could argue that the majority of Rasselas, the sections in which the characters are located in and around Cairo, is permeated by an awareness of Ottoman dominance. The Ottomans had invaded that section of what we would today call Egypt and a little bit of the Arabian Peninsula, and had been basically kind of dominating it since 1517. So with Johnson's critical attitude toward empire and his particularly complex attitudes to the Ottoman Empire in mind, let us turn to Irene and Rasselas. So this is just an image of the original epilogue from Irene, and I won't be discussing it specifically, but it kind of gives you a sense of how the Ottomans, the Turks, are being presented there stereotypically on the English stage in the 1740s and even earlier than that. So you can see that there's issues of gender. There's the implication that there's a harem, this concentration of 50 women under one man, the tyrant. So there's very much an alignment of patriarchal despotism with Ottoman despotism. So with Irene, it's set against the religio-political backdrop of the historical conquest of Constantinople by Mehmed II. That he is fictionalized as the Sultan Muhammad. There's a lot of slippage in 18th century British literature between pretty much all Muslim men and Muhammad. So that's something to kind of keep an eye on. But anyway, so the conquest of Constantinople was a historical event in 1453, and Irene juxtaposes this. Within the play, Johnson juxtaposes the fates of Aspasia, a stalwart Christian heroine, fortified by a masculine education, and I'll talk later about why hers is masculine, with Irene, a more traditionally educated woman who ends up converting to Islam. Now, it's useful to remember here that both of these women at the beginning of the play are Christian. They're from Constantinople, but they're basically kind of Eastern Christian women. Johnson relied on the long representational tradition of the Ottoman despot to indicate the political and personal importance of women's proper moral and intellectual education. Captured during the conquest, the two women are friends and Greek refugees with whom Muhammad alternately falls in love. And that's kind of narrated, we don't really see this, but it's narrated to us that Muhammad tries to seduce Aspasia and she rebuffs him, and so he turns to Irene because he thinks she's more malleable. In one important passage, he responds, so this is Muhammad responding to Irene. He responds to her concern that conversion to Islam would imperil her immortal soul, and this is a big stereotype in 18th century English literature. It occurs all over the place. So this is a very stereotypical dynamic that Johnson is dramatizing. That Islam would imperil her immortal soul, and he scoffs. So Irene has been like, no, I will lose my immortal soul if I convert to Islam. And Muhammad's response is, vain raptures all, for your inferior natures, formed to delight and happy by delighting, heaven has preserved no future paradise, but bids you rove the paths of bliss, secure of total death and careless of hereafter. So your soul is not going to be immortal. So don't worry about it. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you die, basically. While heaven's high minister, whose awful volume records each act, each thought of sovereign man, surveys your plates with inattentive glance and leaves the lovely trifler unregarded. So basically he's saying women are not moral agents. Men are. Men need to worry about the hereafter and the afterlife because they have souls. Women don't need to worry about it. We see here the oft-repeated early modern tension between the stereotypically lascivious Muslim despot and his stereotypical foil, the virtuous Christian heroine. The basic plot of Irene, as David Nichols Smith has shown, had been extant since the mid-16th century, if not much earlier, although Johnson departed from his sources considerably. As Smith puts it, the great moralist, Johnson, as he was soon to be called, converted a record of senseless cruelty into a study of temptation. The tale underscores the irrational sexual violence associated with the stereotype of the Turkish Sultan. According to the tale, the Ottoman Sultan fell in love with a beautiful Greek slave after she was captured at the siege of Constantinople in 1453. He became so enamored of her that his army commanders began to doubt his ability to achieve further military glory. Incensed, the Sultan staged a spectacle in which he had the beautiful Greek, arrayed in her loveliest accoutrements, displayed before his men. When they had all admitted they could not withstand her beauty, he promptly killed her as a proof of his willpower. And this kind of exercised the imaginations of a lot of Europeans. You see it in French literature as well. I'm most familiar with the British, so it pops up a lot. And this is an image of it from this is 1780s. So this is the Muhammad killing Irene here. According to Smith, Italian bishop and writer Matteo Bandello first fictionalized the account around 1554. Writers in French, English, William Painter, and Latin quickly took up the tale. So this is throughout the 16th century. Richard Knollys drew on both the Latin writers and Painter in writing his 1603 A General History of the Turks, which was hugely influential. In most people got their knowledge of or what they took to be their knowledge of the Ottoman Empire from Knollys and from Reichhot's continuation of Knollys. There were also a handful of English plays based on the tale, and several 18th century English women were familiar with the tale through Knollys. Johnson alters the story to analyze how a tense political scenario brings two different modes of female learning to fruition. Both Aspasia and Irene are intelligent, pious Christians, yet Aspasia's education has been more rigorous than Irene's. Muhammad at first falls in love with Aspasia, but she is so stalwart in her rejection of him that he soon turns to the more accommodating Irene, of equal beauty but of softer mien, fear in her eye, submission on her tongue. Kathleen Knowlton Kemmerer notes that Irene dramatizes Johnson's assumptions about women's rationality and the relationship of their education to virtue. By naming the play Irene, Johnson focuses attention on her conflict, on what he feels to be her real tragedy. Yet Irene is not the morally exemplary heroine of the play. Rather, her moral struggle and the working out of her choices provides the drama. So Irene is the focus of the drama, but it's Aspasia who is the moral center of the play. Aspasia warns Irene not to let cowardice obscure her sense of the eternal perspective. So she's reminding her, you need to care about your immortal soul. No physical torments that Muhammad can subject them to can outweigh those of the anguished soul in eternity. She tells Irene, reflect that life and death affecting sounds are only varied modes of endless being. Reflect that life, like every other blessing, derives its value from its use alone. Thus life with loss of wealth is well preserved, and virtue cheaply saved with loss of life. Irene is not convinced. She continually denies that she can practice the same fortitude as Aspasia, or that such fortitude would be demanded of her. Irene identifies the main difference between the two women as one of education. Not all like thee, she tells Aspasia, can brave the shocks of fate. Thy soul by nature great, enlarged by knowledge, soars unencumbered with our idle cares, and all Aspasia but her beauty's man. So essentially, Aspasia has the beauty of a woman, but everything else about her is a man. So Irene is essentially saying that Aspasia is a beautiful woman, but mentally she's been educated with the stereotypical vigor of a man rather than a woman. Irene locates Aspasia's strength of mind and character in her masculine education. Aspasia tries to convince Irene that women's weakness is learned rather than essential. As she says, we learn to shudder at the rustling breeze. So we women start at the light and tremble in the dark, till affectation ripening to belief and folly frighted at her own chimeras, habitual cowardice usurps the soul. So she's really emphasizing that women's virtue, or rather, let me approach it this way. Cowardice, women are stereotypically seen as more cowardly than men. Her point is women learn this cowardice. This is not natural or innate to women. This is part of a bad female education that trains women to be weak. Aspasia criticizes the faultiness of a specifically feminine education, cowardice. Women learn to shudder, and women's souls are usurped not by natural, but by habitual cowardice. Aspasia is an illustrious witness, willing to speak the truth to tyranny. But Irene is no martyr, and she lacks the intellectual foundation to defend herself against Muhammad's enticing suggestion to turn her thoughts henceforth to love and empire. Johnson thus makes love, and notably empire, predominantly the concern only of inadequately educated women. Irene at first objects by asserting her immortality. So I've just looked at Aspasia versus Irene, and now Irene coming back to the seduction scene with Muhammad. So she tells Muhammad, must I for these renounce the hope of heaven, immortal crowns and fullness of enjoyment? Although initially amused by and dismissive of the notion that women could be immortal, as we saw before, Muhammad begins to gain ground when he changes his approach to her. When Irene proceeds to claim women's equal rationality and love of glory to men, she seems not to realize that in restructuring her argument to base women's value on temporal assets like empire, which are within Muhammad's power to bestow, she has weakened her position. She says, then let me once in honor of our sex assume the boastful arrogance of man. Do not we share the comprehensive thought, so do not we women share the comprehensive thought with men, the enlivening wit, the penetrating reason, beats not the female breast with generous passions, the thirst of empire and the love of glory. So here we see Irene making her moral error, that she's choosing empire, even though she has some reasoning that she wants to help her fellow countrymen. She's using empire as her motivation, and this is her downfall. And I'm just going to show this passage. I'm not going to discuss it, but I do think it's useful to just be aware that this Muhammad's counselor, Kali, tells him, extended empire like expanded gold exchanges solid strength for feeble splendor. And I think this is the real heart of Johnson's objection to empire, that it depletes the strength of those who are doing the imperial expansion, and it doesn't help the people. He says elsewhere, colonization does not help people who are being colonized. So that's I'm focusing on the women in this talk, but Kali I think gives the kind of the central critique of empire in Irene. This identification of women's worth with that of men's in the temporal world gives Muhammad the leverage that will be Irene's undoing, for he immediately grants her the recognition her rhetoric demanded and identifies it with his own demands. So we can see why her moral error was also a tactical error. Illustrious maid, he tells her, new wonders fix me thine. Thy soul completes the triumphs of thy face. Will it not charm a mind like thine exalted, to shine the goddess of applauding nations, to scatter happiness and plenty round thee, to bid the prostrate captive rise and live, to see new cities, tower at thy command, and blasted kingdoms flourish at thy smile. This argument appeals to Irene's piety, warped by a misguided and short-sighted vanity, and she agrees to marry Muhammad in the hopes that she will be the means of saving her persecuted fellow Christians. But Irene's is a moral as well as an intellectual error from Aspasia's point of view. Irene ignores what Aspasia had already warned her about and will warn her about again. She is seeking refuge in the power she thinks she will have over her lover, not realizing that temporal power is unreliable even for rulers, and that the wife of a sultan has little power beyond what he chooses to give her. When Irene feels certain of her triumph, she abandons Aspasia's precepts and scoffs that her former friend is afraid of greatness. So there are a number of moments where the male characters, whether they are in front of Irene and Aspasia or not, show some doubt about Irene's integrity, and it turns out that they were correct to suspect her. And I think Johnson is also showing that this performance of femininity that we see with Irene is a performance, that she calls herself weak, but when it really comes down to it, she's willing to sacrifice her friend as soon as it looks like she herself can have worldly glory. So Aspasia delivers a sharp rebuttal to Irene's attack that, oh, well, you're only being virtuous because you don't want worldly glory. So Aspasia is like, hold up. Well mayest thou hide in labyrinths of sound the cause that shrinks from reason's powerful voice. Stoop from thy flight, so stop being arrogant. Trace back the entangled thought and set the glittering fallacy in view. And I would say that for Johnson, empire itself is a glittering fallacy. Not power I blame, but power obtained by crime. Angelic greatness is angelic virtue. Amidst the glare of courts, the shout of armies, will not the apostate feel the pangs of guilt and wish too late for innocence and peace? Cursed is the tyrant of the infernal realms, so Satan, with gloomy state and agonizing pomp. Aspasia deploys the Miltonic imagery of Satan to show the flaws of Irene's thinking, just as Irene's death proves Aspasia right about women's relative power. Muhammad, wrongly believing that Irene has betrayed him, has her strangled by mutes without even giving her an opportunity to defend herself. Kemmerer concludes of Irene's execution by mutes, their silence is physically enforced, hers culturally mandated. She is executed without trial, without opportunity of making a defense. She dies innocent and ignorant of the cause of Muhammad's change of heart. Lacking Aspasia's rigorously rational masculine education, Irene suffers in the temporal world, knowing that she dies innocent of betraying her husband, but also knowing that she has freely chosen to imperil her immortal fate. Johnson makes it clear that giving a woman a stereotypically female education is a moral as well as much as an intellectual disservice. It stunts their temporal relationships, convinces them to prefer imperial glory to patriotic virtue, and endangers their immortal identities. So moving on to Rasselas. So this is a 1715 map of what Johnson calls Abyssinia. We would think of it as the Ethiopian Empire. So this pink section here is Abyssinia. And you can see that they go up to Cairo, which is about there. So the stage of Rasselas it's basically kind of like up toward here in in Abyssinia, and then they go up to Cairo. So it's kind of this section here that they're traveling in. Similarly, in his philosophical novel Rasselas of 1759, so a decade after, Johnson presents a group of privileged travelers, though notably these are also Christian. They're Monophysite Christians from the Ethiopian Empire of Abyssinia. And did I include, okay, sorry. I'll talk about what Monophysite Christianity is in a bit. So these are Christians in the Ethiopian Empire of Abyssinia on a quest to discover what constitutes the happy life. Bored with living in the isolated comfort of the Happy Valley, the eponymous prince sets out to see the world with his sister, the Princess Nikaya, her faithful servant Pekwa. She's the servant, but she's also really a close friend as well, and their guide Imluk, a philosopher poet. The travelers observe all different levels of society in many different countries, but their quest remains famously unconcluded. Okay, I think, did I mess up my slides? I think I messed up my slides slightly. Okay, let's start here and I'll go back. Rasselas owes a debt to the no, I didn't. Sorry about that. Let's go back here. Okay, Rasselas owes a debt to the increasingly popular genre of the Oriental tale, which tended to involve elements of fantasy, magic, as our previous paper was about, and exotic travel. Johnson, ever the moral instructor, used the Oriental tale to address several central philosophical questions, such as the nature of the soul, the proper training to produce poetry, and how women should be educated. Okay, I'm going to, I don't know what I was thinking with my organization of these last couple of slides, but Monophysite Christianity, just real quickly without getting into early Christian theology and heresies, basically Catholicism and Anglicanism and some of the kind of traditional Western Christian churches believe that Christ has a dual nature, so he's both God and man. Monophysite Christianity believes that he has only one nature, so that's why they're not in communion with the Western Christian Church, but they are Christian. So it's kind of basically it's Eastern Christianity, and there's different versions of it, but it's a specific version of Eastern Christianity is what Rasselas and his friends are. Yes, okay. I think we're back on track. The travelers learn about the world, various philosophies, and themselves as they encounter strange lands and foreign customs. When the group explores the pyramids, however, Arabs abduct Pekwa. A note here on the cultural dynamic that Johnson is showcasing. The Ottomans had invaded Egypt and the northern areas of the Arabian Peninsula, and it had been controlling them since 1517. Thus, most of the narrative outside of the Happy Valley, where the novel starts and that Rasselas wants to get out of in order to see the world, most of the places outside of that occur in territory controlled, at least nominally, by the Ottomans. So the Ottoman Empire is kind of a looming presence over everything that happens in Rasselas after they leave the Happy Valley. The Arab chieftain is well aware of this distinction, so this is the person who kidnapped Pekwa, explaining to Pekwa that the sons of Ishmael, Arabs, are the natural and hereditary lords of this part of the continent, which is usurped by late invaders and low-born tyrants from whom we are compelled to take by the sword what is denied to justice. As Keemer points out, though the Arab chieftain technically has a harem, he does not conform to the English stereotype of the lascivious Muslim leader, and he is violently opposed, like literally violently opposed to the Ottoman Empire. The Turks are his enemies. So from his point of view, the Turks are the imperialists in his homeland. Meanwhile, the separation from Nikaya enables Pekwa to learn how to conquer her fear. So this is an interesting kind of callback to female cowardice and how you can unlearn it or learn bravery. In the Arab seraglio, away from Nikaya, she begins to take charge of her servants and to set them an example of courage. Yes. After her recovery, so when they have ransomed her back and she's back with Nikaya, Pekwa recounts her experience in the harem in terms that highlight the differences between her own monophysite Christian education and the education, or what Johnson saw as the lack of it, and that she perceives in the women of the harem. So this would be a Muslim space. As Pekwa describes them, the diversions of the women were only childish play by which the mind, accustomed to stronger operations, could not be kept busy. I could do all which they delighted in doing by powers merely sensitive, so just bodily, while my intellectual faculties were flown to Cairo. They ran from room to room as a bird hops from wire to wire. So notice there's a lot of animal imagery in here, so it's very dehumanizing. As a bird hops from wire to wire in his cage, they danced for the sake of motion as lambs frisk in a meadow. Their business was only needlework, in which I and my maids sometimes helped them. But you know that the mind will easily straggle from the fingers, nor will you suspect that captivity and absence from Nikaya could receive solace from silken flowers. And you'll notice, if those of you who are familiar with 18th century women's writing, silken flowers pops up a lot as kind of a model of weak femininity. So not an intellectual femininity, a very kind of weak, performative, stereotypical version of womanhood. Nor was much satisfaction to be hoped from their conversation, for of what could they be expected to talk? They had seen nothing, for they had lived from early youth in that narrow spot. And here Johnson is clearly kind of playing with Lockean notions of experience and education. So again, this is being described as bad female education. Of what they, in that narrow spot, of what they had not seen, they could have no knowledge, for they could not read. They had no ideas but of the few things that were within their view, and had hardly names for anything but their clothes and their food. Though the chieftain is technically in charge of a harem, and you would expect that to kind of fit in with the assumption about the stereotypical assumptions about Muslim men in 18th century British literature, Johnson is actually kind of upturning this with the chieftain, because he has a harem, but he doesn't respond to it the way that you would expect a lascivious stereotypical despot to do. He finds the women whose attentions are forced to focus on him entirely boring, unintelligent, and uninspiring. The suggestion of the chieftain's preference for Pekwa tacitly points to the preference of a Johnsonian type anti-imperialist for a well-educated, intelligent Christian woman. So to conclude, Rasselas is famously unconcluded, but since I must, despite his philosophical critique of both European and Ottoman Empire, Johnson vilified characteristics stereotypically associated with the Ottoman Turks: despotism, lasciviousness, luxury, military conquest, women's ignorance of their moral agency. He's not alone in doing this, but he's certainly participating in this representational tradition. So he does this to argue that a well-educated woman would withstand the allurement of empire. Thus, Johnson assigns moral superiority to Christian education, though not to European empire, by contradistinguishing different kinds of education available to women within the Ottoman Empire. Women might delight an intelligent man, but they were not formed to do so. Similarly, empire might delight some people, but these are not the heroes of Johnson's fiction. Unfortunately, it is the case that Johnson made these arguments about intelligent delight by juxtaposing stereotypical models of Christian and Muslim education for women. That juxtaposition has continued to delight colonialists, imperialists, and their latter-day avatars into the present day. Thank you. All right, I will stop sharing and mute myself.
Thank you, Dr. Cahill, for an interesting paper, a detailed analysis of Samuel Johnson's texts, which gave us a good insight into his mind, into his beliefs. It was very interesting the way you showed how the reactions or the responses to the Ottoman Empire were often from an imperial envy point. Extremely interesting. And then there was, of course, this complete, somewhat blurring of the division between banditry and resistance, which also brings up, which is something which we see increasingly throughout the 20th century. And another very modern feature I thought was your explanation of the gender understanding, a very, very near modern understanding of male and female, of masculine and feminine characteristics. I'm sure there will be many questions which students and research scholars, colleagues will be asking you. But before that, we will take questions for Dr. Shubha. So I will now pass the speaker on to Professor Chandrabha Chakraborty. Over to you, Chandrabha.
Thank you, Shiprati. We have innumerable questions which are being typed on the YouTube chat box, but unfortunately we'll have to limit ourselves, otherwise we'll have to continue overnight. So I have chosen about 7-8 questions for Professor Nandi. Meanwhile, Professor Shipra Mukherjee can sort the questions which are meant for Samara. I will move over to Professor Nandi and I will ask the first question, which has been posted by Bishwajit Bishwash of Taki Government College. His question is, how far did the contemporary Orientalists share the views of Eliot's magic? No, Shugata. Yes, Shugata. How far did the contemporary Orientalists share the views? We can't see you. I think there is, we can't see you. How far did the contemporary Orientalists share the views of Eliot's magic?
Can you see me now? And here? See and hear?
I can hear, but I can't see you. Anyway.
Okay.
We can't see you, Shugata. We can't see you.
Okay.
We can see you. Yeah.
Hold on. Something must be wrong. Something must have gone wrong.
I mean,
okay.
Doesn't matter.
At least we can hear you.
Okay. I can answer the question right away. So basically the question asks whether other Orientalists were in, did they concur with Eliot or did they differ with him? Well, the answer is yes and no. It's a very interesting question, and that's all the paper is all about. Well, there's a body of Orientalists who would say, like, let's begin with the fact that Eliot himself, though being a scientist, is an Orientalist, because he says, and if I had more time, I would have quoted passages from his treatise on tropical ophthalmology. He begins the book by saying that ophthalmology in the West is very different from what it is in the tropics, because the tropics are hot, the tropics are dusty, the tropics are more the tropics make you more prone to diseases. So it's a very different place. So that way he is most certainly an Orientalist, but he differs from that variant of the other variant of Orientalists who believe that the Orient is unique, but it's not necessarily inferior. A man like Eliot would say that the Orient is unique and it's inferior because its magic cannot be compared with the magic of the West. The magic of the West is far superior than that, and whatever the East does, the West can do better. And if there are any tricks like the rope trick, which the West cannot do, then of course West cannot perform, then it's certainly got to do with lies and hoaxes and fraud. So this is what he said. And the other thing is, what about these other people who had differed with him? I mean, what's very interesting is that Eliot died in 1936, and he carried out this debate up to the end of 1935, and after that he was very sick, and he couldn't take part in the debate any longer. That's why he didn't take part in the debate after from early 1936 onwards. But it continued in spite of his death, and it continued up to 1939-40 till the time the war begins, and it overshadows everything. So, and what I found is, you see, I mentioned a book by an American hypnotist right at the end called Ormond McGill. Now, Ormond McGill had written this book, and he says that all the tricks of the Indian magician are informed by some or another religious tradition of India, and they have occult knowledge. The Indian magician, he may be poor, he may be nameless, he may be performing on the street, but at the end of the day, he has occult knowledge. So the chances of the majority accepting Eliot's conclusions about Indian magic was in fact slim, even during his heydays in the 1930s. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sugata. There is another question which has been placed by Shohini Mukherjee. She is a research scholar in our department. Why was India believed to be a fountainhead of magic, since Orientalist discourse also emphasized the mystery and magic of the Middle East in texts like The 1001 Night? So that is
this is also a very interesting question. You know, I'll have to tell you a bit about Western magic and its fancy with magic of other countries. It all starts during the Enlightenment, when it became possible for Westerners to explore the cultures of other countries with a high degree of certitude and a solid body of knowledge, which were very often based on observations and actual travel to those countries. Things took, I mean, there was a giant leap forward when Napoleon conquered Egypt. That was a time at the beginning of the 1800s when the fancy moved from the Orient in general to Egyptian magic. And then the British conquered England, then the British conquered India. And from early, from say about 1813, 1815, a fancy for Indian magic started growing in Britain, and then it spread to all other West European and countries and America and the white settler colonies of England. So the Middle East continued to be a home of magic nonetheless, but the superiority of being the true home of magic shifted to India. The West had always believed that magic, you get to see magic in places which are unmodern. The Middle East was unmodern, India was unmodern, but the kind of magic that Indians could perform couldn't be seen in any other part of the world. You know, there's a book by a historian called Christopher Goto Jones. If you find it, read it. It's on Orientalism and magic. He says that the fancy with Indian magic grew out of the fact that in other countries of the Orient, for example, Japan, China, magic was almost a theatrical performance. There was a stage, there was a set, the magician would dress up in a certain manner. In India, magic was practically everywhere. And the funny thing with Indian magic is it doesn't threaten anybody. It's entertaining. A boy just climbs up a rope and he vanishes into thin air, then he reappears from the crowd. All these things, it doesn't threaten anybody. It doesn't threaten the empire. So what happened is with time, and as I said during my talk, that initially India and China were taken together to be the homeland of magic. But later, with the rise of the Theosophical Society, which was founded in 1875, Tibet replaced China, because Blavatsky said that he met the Mahatmas, the great souls who taught her theosophy and taught her occultism and magic and all these things in Tibet. She had actually never been to Tibet. It was all a figment of imagination. But at that point, the fancy with China started fading out and the fancy with Tibet replaced it. But the fancy with Indian magic didn't fade out. It remained all the way through up to the 1950s, and it remains to be seen whether Indian magic, Indian magic can define the magic of any other country, because anthropologists have gone to all other parts of the world. They have come to small islands on the Pacific, and they traveled to Africa and gathered knowledge of magic from there. But there was something unique about Indian magic, was that, and which is, Indian magic was an entertaining art. It wasn't like the magic of the shaman, which is has to do with healing. Not that I'm saying that the Indian didn't have magical healing traditions, but the magic that I'm talking about is fundamentally a kind of entertainment. And it remained, and the inability of the Western performer to perform tricks of the Indian magician with the same kind of dexterity which the Indian magician could display during his performance, I believe contributed immensely. The most intriguing kind of magic in the world, as for it. I can't hear you. I can't hear you.
Yes.
Hello. Yeah, I can hear you now.
Yes.
Yeah.
We move on to the third question, which is actually the question posed by Atre Mukherjee, our colleague from the Department of Philosophy. There are two related questions. One is, was Middle East also included in the list? I think you have already answered this part quite exhaustively. The second question is, we have mention of witches in Shakespeare's plays. So notionally, magic did exist in European countries. So your comment on that?
Yes, magic does exist in European countries, and magic existed up to the 1950s. If you look at the body of litigation on magic, the amount of laws which were made on made against magical practices, against magical beliefs in England, which continued to be made up to the 1950s, is fascinating. But there is again a tendency in Europe for marginalizing magic, which originates during the time of the Renaissance. Magic was increasingly seen as something evil, something which deserves to be marginalized, something which should be excluded from society, and such a belief grew all the way through the history. If you read the history of Tudor and Stuart England, this is a trend which becomes stronger and stronger, and it led to in England first, and then in France, it led to the criminalization of witchcraft. Then there was a phase when, which I believe you're familiar with, the burning of the witches, which took place all over Europe and also in America. And this is a fallout of the Renaissance and of the Reformation, of Reformation, which happens immediately afterwards. And but nonetheless, a tendency to believe, magic can be defined in several ways. But if you look at magic the way an anthropologist is going to define it, then magic exists in the absence of science. And due to the absence of science in parts of the West, people continue to believe in magic, and which kind of diminished with the advance of science and technology, and with man's better understanding of his immediate environment and better control over it. So magic continued to be in use up to the 1950s, I said. I mean, I can cite an interesting example. You mentioned witches. There used to be a kind of people who were referred to as the cunning folk in England. The cunning folk are basically fraudsters who sold made-to-order miracles. They would be itinerant fraudsters who would travel from one place to the other, selling made-to-order miracles to gullible people, and they continue to be in high demand in rural areas of England up to the 1950s, when the British Parliament passed a law against them, and there was a kind of what we might call sort of a crackdown against them. Not exactly the crackdown as in a violent crackdown, but nonetheless a kind of police action against them so as to marginalize and criminalize these people. So people continue to believe in magic in spite of the advance in science and technology and everything. And I also mentioned spiritualism. Spiritualism existed all the way through, but the difference with spiritualism in the past and the spiritualism in the 19th century is that 19th century spiritualism claimed to discover or to invent a scientific mechanism of spirit communication, so that the soul of the departed can be present among us, and we could communicate with the soul of the departed. And this is what happened, and this is what people believed in up to, say, the 1940s. And strangely, such belief, in spite of the advances in technology and science, grew stronger up to the 1940s. And it was very strong immediately after the First World War, because immediately after the First World War, when many young men were dead, their families took recourse to spiritualism. And one of the reasons they took recourse to spiritualism, they would call a medium to their place and conduct a seance. And part of this was to, and this was largely generated by, this was largely informed by the belief that you could actually have a scientific mechanism of talking to the dead. So the belief in magic doesn't wear out with advancing technology. So I don't think I'll be able to carry on. I should carry on even further because there are other questions.
Yeah. Thank you, Sugata. There are indeed several questions, and I'm constantly, sorting them. Another is by Rajoshi Shengupta. His Mothi. He's the assistant professor from Bojbaj Institute of Technology. His question is: isn't labeling Indian magic as supernatural or equating it with the occult as a manner of looking at it through a colonial lens, or something beyond comprehension?
It's actually both of these things.
Yeah, exactly.
Indian magic as occult is, of course, magicians. A funny thing is, up to the 17th century, magicians in the West were necessarily seen as occultists. Then came the Enlightenment. The magicians transcended the boundary of occultism and they became amateur scientists. After the 1840s, the magicians, they styled themselves as amateur scientists and they had nothing to do with occultism. Then from the 1870s came a phase when Western magicians started decrying occultism as complete hoax. So to label Indian magic as occult and to label Indian magic as spiritual is most certainly a colonial tendency, and above all is an Orientalist tendency.
Absolutely, thank you. There is another question which is perhaps a little related. This is the relation between yogic power and Indian magic, whether there is any light on this thrown by R.H.ELLIOT. I don't know.
Oh, yes, there is. As a matter of fact, yes. Yeah. A funny thing is this happened in America. Eliot was British. He was a Scot. He came here as a British imperialist, but this is something which takes place in America. Americans from the early 19th century had this fancy about the yogi and the fakir. And they thought that the yogi and the fakir are basically these two terms. The yogi and the fakir are these terms are interchangeable and they are synonymous. So in American newspapers, you would come across references of the Hindu fakir. A fakir cannot be a Hindu. A fakir has to be a Muslim. He's a Sufi. And a yogi is a Hindu. So there's a Hindu fakir and the Hindu yogi. They're all synonymous. They took Hinduism to be a unique religion, which is a welter of magical knowledge. And so the belief grew that the Hindu yogi or the Hindu fakir can make a display of their supernatural powers. They're trained in supernatural powers. They know how to use them and they can display those powers. And those are taken to be the equivalent of magic in the West. And this had a commercial benefit for Westerners because from the 1860s, 1870s onwards, a large number of European and American magicians started donning the disguise of Indian yogis and Indian fakirs on stage. Nowadays, it's possible to look at their photographs and find crude drawings of these magicians on Google. You will find that there's no similarity between what we imagine, what we come to imagine when we hear the word yogi and what we see on stage in America, the representation of the yogi in America. But nonetheless, the power of imagination of the yogi being a magician, the yogi being an exponent in supernatural ability, supernatural powers, was so great, was so immense that the Indian magician, the Indian fakir, and the yogi became synonymous. First in America, then slowly in other parts of the world.
Thank you. Trisha Mondol from Vishwabharati wants to know whether there is a connection between myth making and magic regarding the representation of Indian culture. I suppose that's what you were talking about to a large extent. Anyway, your take.
Yeah, I can only partially answer the question because it'll take me much longer to answer it in full. So the thing is, yes, of course, there's a discernible link between myth making and Indian magic, and this is, and for me, the most interesting part was who were the creators of this myth. Indians didn't create a myth that their magic was superior. Indians didn't say that, or Indian magicians didn't say that they were performing with supernatural. They were making a display of their supernatural abilities when they were performing the basket trick or the levitation act or the sword swallowing. Many of these people didn't know English, so they couldn't communicate except for with their performance. And they were very poor. Most of them were illiterate. They didn't write anything. There is no written text on Indian magic produced by an Indian in the 19th century. I mean, by an Indian magician in the 19th century. All stuff that I have been through on Indian magic are written by Westerners. In the 20th century, early 20th century, you find books written on Indian magic by Indians who are trained in Western magic first, and then they write about Indian magic, and they write with the same flair, the same, they follow the same genre established by Westerners. So the myth of Indian magic, the myth that India is a magical land, is produced necessarily, is created, is authored necessarily by people who are not from India. And in my research, I have shown this is a myth created by Westerners in the modern age, with the growth of popular print. Thanks.
Thank you. There is another question from Vishnu Namboride from Tiruvalla, Kerala. He wants to know your stance on Oriental Romanticism.
Now, this is a question which I won't be able to answer because this falls beyond my area of research. So this is a good question, but it's an important question, but it's beyond the jurisdiction of my research.
Another question, I don't know whether, you'll be able to answer this, is by Aris Khan from IGNU. He wants to know what is the impact of radicalism in the modern world in India too. Is this related to our paper? I'm not sure.
Radicalism in modern world and India.
Yes. The impact of radicalism.
Well, this is a different subject altogether because I'm not I'm not talking about this thing now. So it's a topic of political history. Maybe maybe I can take another question in place of that.
No, I think we had enough questions. We can, again, as I said, we can go on, but we will also have to take questions for Samara, which are as...
Oh, sure. Please.
So over to Professor Shipra Mukherjee.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chandrabha. Samara, I've curated a few questions from the many which came up. The first is by Otri Mojumdar, a research scholar, who asks, can the roots of racism and Islamophobia be traced to the 18th century?
That's a good question. Islamophobia has been around since before the 18th century. But I will say that modern racism, by which I mean an investment in racial hierarchies that obviously don't exist, that is to a certain extent being calcified in the 18th century. But I would put it a little bit earlier than that. Really, it's where, and again, the Ottomans kind of come in here. Several scholars have talked about the fact that cultural hierarchies start forming after the European discovery of the Americas. So the fact that there's this entire continent that is discovered kind of shifts everybody's geographical awareness. So from the European point of view, they are the whole reason that they discover the Americas is that they're trying to find a way around the Ottoman dominance of the Silk Road that goes into the Mediterranean. So when they get to the Americas and they start colonizing people, they start creating all of these racial hierarchies somewhat in response to the fact that the mentality is kind of like, oh, well, now we have somebody to look down on, and the Ottomans have been, basically we had to go cap in hand to the Ottomans. They were the ones who were in control of the Mediterranean and of all of the trade routes into the Mediterranean. So the Europeans are like, oh yay, we can dominate somebody now. So those racial hierarchies that are becoming calcified in the 18th century are really kind of forming already in the late 15th, 16th, 17th century. So I think Walter Manolo has talked about the fact that coloniality is the flip side of modernity. And I realize that people have different notions of modernity and you don't necessarily have to agree with Manolo, but I do think that the whole relationship of Europe to what we today call Latin America, to the North American indigenous peoples, has a lot to do with the sense of what you mentioned earlier, imperial envy, and the need to create this sense of superiority where it really wasn't originally. And I think it's important to see racism as not, it's very much something that is from ignorance, but it's also out of self-interest. I think Ibrahim Kendry has been talking about this in relation to the Black Lives Matter protests, and talking about the fact that yes, racism comes from ignorance, but it also comes from self-interest. And if you are used to the Ottoman Empire being dominant, and all of a sudden you have this opportunity to dominate yourself, you may take advantage of that. And I think that that's what the Europeans did, and it was in their interest to fabricate these racial hierarchies. So that's certainly being solidified in the 18th century, though it predates the 18th century, I would say.
Thank you, Samara. The second question is by Dipro Shen, research scholar, Department of History, Jadavpur University. How would you situate ruler versus ruled, the notion of the ruler versus the ruled, while talking about empire building vis-a-vis Johnson's hypothesis?
Johnson he's an unusual guy in the 18th century, and I think that kind of comes into focus when Boswell, who is pro-slavery, is talking about Johnson being anti-slavery. In the full passage in the life of Johnson, Johnson actually talks about this very specific case that this man, former slave or the slave is looking for his freedom in the Scottish courts, and Boswell is Scottish, Johnson is English, so there's a little bit of national rivalry between them. But they're talking about this very specific case of one man looking for his freedom. And Johnson makes a very interesting distinction between slavery, which comes and has existed long before the transatlantic slave trade. Johnson is saying, look, I mean, if you are captured in war and become enslaved, fine, that's happened all throughout history. The different kettle of fish, because in no other model of slavery is a man's children also enslaved. So he resists the whole notion that slavery is a natural state, which is, of course, what, if you're going to be racist and say, oh, slavery, that the racial hierarchy is natural and essential. Johnson did not believe that. So he did not necessarily believe that slavery couldn't happen, because historically, like in ancient history, everybody had slaves. Everybody was, this was part of war. But when it comes to the transatlantic slave trade, he absolutely does not believe it's a natural thing. So I think Johnson, you lose a war, then you will be ruled by whoever wins the war. But that doesn't mean that that's a natural inferiority. That doesn't mean that you naturally owe this person your obedience. That would be something that would have to be worked out in law and in civil society, or perhaps in another war. But there's nothing natural about that subjection.
Thank you, Samara. This next question is a somewhat general question, but maybe you could take a shot at it. This is from Ambarish Upadhyay, research scholar of West Bengal State University. is there any difference in the stereotyping of Muslims by the imperialists of the 18th century in their writings and that of today's Western writers?
That's a good question. There are some differences, but my scholarship focuses on the similarities. Now, one big difference is that when you talk about 18th century British society, you're talking about a society with a state religion. So nobody is secular, and nobody is, if you're an atheist, you do not admit it. Like David Hume was an atheist, he was not upfront about that. So you're dealing with a civil religious society, which most modern world powers would consider themselves secular, even if they have large swaths of their population would consider themselves religious. So it's interesting to me how secular arguments in the 20th and 21st century have kind of co-opted a lot of arguments that arose in a religious rivalry. So I do think we need to keep an eye on that, because some of these arguments, so for instance, we still have, in political discourse today, we still have this tendency to, in the West, to say, oh, well, those poor women, they're so subjectified, and they're so repressed, and they're so ignorant, and we have to go in and save them. And so this is, the white feminist savior complex. That completely ignores the history of feminism, or some women are uncomfortable with the word feminism because it has colonial associations. But women's advocacy, white feminists unfortunately have ignored long histories of women's advocacy in non-Western places. Egypt had a thriving women's rights activism. So. And in some ways, predates what the West was doing. The funny thing about this notion of Muslim women are more oppressed than Western women is that, as Lady Mary Wortley Montagu pointed out, in some ways the women of the Ottoman Empire had a lot more freedom than Western women. They certainly had better property rights. That's something that a lot of Western scholarship doesn't talk about. And the irony is that a lot of the assumptions that we have about Muslim women and their ignorance comes from these stereotypes of the harem and the seraglio, which of course, which Westerners were in these harems in the 18th century? They weren't. So a lot of the notions that we stereotypically have in the West about Muslim women come from fantasy and from fabrications. And specifically for Western feminism, and it pains me to say this because I love Mary Wollstonecraft, but her vindication of the rights of women very much kind of enshrines that attitude that Muslim women need to be educated by their Western sisters, so that they need to be saved from Muslim men who shunt them away into these harems and keep them ignorant. So and Wollstonecraft never went to the Ottoman Empire. She's getting all of this textually. So it's very much like what Edward Said says, that Westerners, for the most part, they couldn't travel to these distant locations, so they were relying on textual reports that could not be, as Professor Nandi mentioned, they can't easily be verified or resisted. So a lot of the Western perceptions of Islam, which are Islamophobic, come from these realms of fantasy, but also from straight up self-interest as well.
The last question that I have for you today is, we do not know who the questioner is. The person has possibly signed herself or himself as Shams, I don't know. The question goes like this: is Rasselas seen to express hostility to the rising imperialism of his day and to reject stereotypical Orientalist viewpoints that justified colonialism?
Rasselas. Okay, so there's Rasselas the book, and then there's Rasselas the character in the book. The tension between Rasselas, who's very young and very innocent and naive, and his kind of mentor Imlek is interesting because essentially you could make an argument that Imlek is speaking for Johnson, and so within the story of Rasselas, you have the prince often kind of, being very much the young man, and, he's virtuous and he's idealistic, and he's like, well, if I were in charge, I would do this. And often Imlek kind of has to correct him. So Imlek is kind of the intellectual center of the story. And he has some very interesting views on empire specifically, but the grandeur of empire, which I think you could associate with colonialism. I would say that, so Imlek, when they're at the pyramids, Imlek kind of has this philosophical discourse about how Egyptian grandeur far outweighs what modern European grandeur is capable of doing. So on the one hand, he's kind of subordinating European imperial grandeur. On the other hand, he's also taking the Egyptian pyramids as kind of an emblem of all human temporal grandeur, all empire, you could say all colonialism, because colonialism is about wealth accumulation and extraction. So I would say that, yes, you could make a strong case for saying that it's definitely anti-imperialist, anti-colonial, yes, more subtly, I would say. Johnson is he has issues with colonialism precisely because of the concentration of wealth that happens and because of the resource extraction that happens. So you see that repeatedly in his writing, and you can see that subtly going on in Rasselas. Although I would say that the critique of empire is more to the front. Does that answer your question? Does that answer the question?
I guess so. Thank you. Thank you, Samara, for your very careful consideration of all the questions. And with that, I hand it over to Chandrabha. Over to you, Chandrabha. Chandrabha's
hello.
Vote of thanks.
I would now request Shomok to deliver, our colleague, Dr. Shomok Mondol, to deliver the vote of thanks. Yeah.
Good evening, everyone. So, first of all, we thank Professor Basab Chaudhuri, the Honorable Vice Chancellor of the West Bengal State University, for all his encouragement and inputs to the English department. We also thank Professor Arun Hota, Director of the IQAC cell of West Bengal State University, for collaborating with the English department and helping in organizing this event today. We also especially thanked our esteemed speakers, Dr. SAMARA CAHILL, and our very own faculty member, Dr. SUGATA Nandi, for the truly brilliant, informative, and illuminating talks today. I also take this opportunity to thank Professor Chandrabha Chakraborty, the head of the English department, for brilliantly planning, conceptualizing, and implementing the entire event today. I also want to thank Professor Shipra Mukherjee and Dr. Sneha Kaur Chaudhuri for their active participation in conducting the academic sessions this evening. It will be great justice on my part if I don't thank our technical support team. Our ex-student Auritra Banerjee single-handedly managed the YouTube form, the Google Meet platform. Hats off to him. We are really happy to have a student like you. All our certificates and posters have been designed by our outgoing semester 4 student, Akash Mukherjee. We thank you as well. And they are ably supported by our ex-student Shilajit Bishwas and our present semester 2 students, Sudipto Dotto and Adrija Ghosh. A special thanks to Mr. Ovik Roy, the librarian of Dirozio Memorial college Orithro in this endeavor. And last but not the least, I thank all the participants, 950 of you out there who registered online and have watched this program, followed this program as live stream on the YouTube. Thank you very much. This webinar a grand success. It's a new experience for all of us, but we're all getting used to it. And more importantly, we're all beginning to enjoy it. So hopefully we'll meet once again in the future. Thank you very much. Over to Chandravati.
I don't think there is much left to be said after the formal vote of thanks is given. So again, my thanks to everybody, and let us call it a day. We will meet again in the future.
Thank you.